The new documentary about John Candy just dropped on Amazon Prime this past Friday, October 10th, and the film opens up with Bill Murray trying to eulogize his friend, and he says a very poignant quote. He says, "I wish I had more bad things to say about him." Now obviously Bill Murray is joking, and he's trying to do a little bit of gallows humor in this case, but that should tell you a lot about John Candy because no one really has a lot of negative things to say about this guy. He was beloved in his time, he's beloved now, and I think he's gonna be beloved forever. The film called John Candy, I Like Me actually begins with his funeral in 1994 and works its way backward. It starts with his childhood, through his teenage years, to his young adult years in Canada growing up in the comedy scene, to his first movie roles, to stardom, and to the end of his life. I actually understand why they started with his funeral and worked backwards. They wanted to show the hole that his death created in this community and in the world as a whole, because his films were very beloved worldwide, and then work back and show the kind of impact he had on these people and who this guy was that made such an impact on the world. So my name is Big Mike, and this is Right on Cue, and this is what I call my first impression series. This is gonna be all of my reviews for all the things I watched for the first time. So not hidden gems, not retro rewinds. These are fresh watches. These are new films, new TV shows that come out that I need to watch and need to review. So this was one of the titles I recommended in my What to Watch in October series, and I knew I was gonna watch it, and I knew it would be a perfect one to recommend for people to watch as well. I know there's a lot of John Candy fans out there, and then for the people who aren't John Candy, maybe who are a little younger or are not familiar with his work, this is a great little introduction to who this guy was, to some of his films, and to the impact he had on a whole generation of people. So I actually found it really interesting that the film opens up and the first 15-20 minutes of the film is actually, John Candy's family. His wife, his son, his daughter, his brother, some other family members, and we talk about John Candy's early childhood days. He had a tragic childhood because of his father's early death, and because he sort of had to become the man of the house at such a young age and help take care of everybody else. So the beginning of the film is really more intimate portrayal of John Candy, who he was as a child, how he grew up, how his family members know him, how his wife, his daughter, his son know him. We spent some time on his childhood and on his teenage years, going through high school, playing football, having a knee injury that prevented him from continuing to play football, which actually was probably a blessing in disguise because it prevented him from enlisting in Vietnam, even though he wanted to, but he had an injury, so he wasn't accepted. But it also pushed him towards acting. John Candy was a huge fan of cinema, and there are interview footage of him talking about his love for the cinema and going to the theaters, watching people like Jackie Gleason and other comedians, and he wanted to be like them. He wanted to be an actor, he wanted to make people laugh. So the documentary does a pretty good job of covering his early years, and then as he began to get into the comedy scene, he was parts of Godspell and Second City, and these were sort of comedy troupes, and he worked with a lot of really famous people who are still famous to this day. I'm talking about Eugene Levy, Martin Short, Dan Aykroyd, Catherine O'Hara, Gilda Radner, and many others. He worked with a lot of really famous people, and there was a big comedy scene there at the time. I mean, all those people I named are big movie stars and had great careers. Second City was described as like the poor man's SNL, which I personally, growing up, used to watch Mad TV, which I described as the poor man's SNL, even though I thought it was more funny because it was more edgy. They could do a little bit more than such a juggernaut like SNL could do because of all the sponsors and endorsements that they had, and they had to really tone things down. Whereas Mad TV, Second City, some of these other performers could kind of do some more risque stuff. In this documentary, they talk about a skit that John Candy was a part of called Yellow Belly, and he was like a deserter in the Civil War. And in the skit, he actually shoots a kid in the back and then a woman in the back. So that's kind of risky if you think about for comedy in the 70s to do that. So they kind of got away with a lot of stuff. Now, as he performed with these groups, at an after party, he met Steven Spielberg. Yeah, that's Steven Spielberg, who wanted him for a role in his film 1941. That was John Candy's kind of first foray into film, and you could tell that he really liked it. He liked that sort of aspect of film. He wanted to work in film more, and that kind of started him towards the film path. He became a pretty big star in the early 80s. He was in Stripes. He got his really big mainstream break in Splash with Tom Hanks. That was a big one. He did Home Alone in the 1990. He did Planes, Trains, and Automobiles in 87, Uncle Buck in 89. By the mid to late 80s, John Candy was a huge name. He was a huge star. He was basically an A-lister at this point. So Splash with Tom Hanks really made him a superstar. But I got to know John Candy best with his work with John Hughes. He worked with John Hughes on, I believe, 7 films that John Hughes either wrote or directed. And Uncle Buck, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Home Alone, The Great Outdoors. There's more. I can put the titles on the side here somewhere. I don't know where I'm pointing. But there's a lot more, and it was this collaboration. They became really good friends because they were similar age, similar lifestyles, similar habits, and everything like that. They became really good friends, and they made some great comedies together. So aside from covering some of his films and hearing from some of his co-stars, there is a bit of a dark side to this documentary because his weight was always a part of his life. He, at a certain point, was, I believe, over 350 pounds. And then he would get in shape, and then Hollywood would be like, no, but we want the funny fat guy. He would smoke, drink, get heavy again. His father's death at such an early age really kind of played on him. He was always fearful of death, of being sick, of people dying. Didn't help when John Belushi died in 1982. And, death and health was always on his mind. And a lot of times we saw in this documentary a lot of interview footage where people ask him about his weight. They always brought it up. Or in the film Stripes, where at the very beginning he's talking about his weight, meaning the role was written specifically for him, but for someone whose weight was a problem, and he didn't like that kind of stuff. I think that's why I really like his films with John Hughes, because he's written as just a normal person. He's just a big guy, but his weight doesn't come into it. It's not a part of his character or plot or story. It's just, that is what it is, and that's what I like about those films. It lets John Candy be John Candy, the sweet, lovable guy. I think a lot of his roles, especially in the mid to late 80s, where he's playing like a father figure, a nice guy and has good emotions and good morals, I think that stems a lot from him basically creating a character who he thought his father could be, but also I think a character who he saw himself as with his kids. In the documentary, his family talks about how sweet he was, how kind he was, how he loved being a family man, he loved being a father. He wasn't into the Hollywood lifestyle, he loved being a family man, and I think that you could see that in the roles he played. The documentary covered a lot of his famous films. I think the one film that I would have loved to hear them cover would have been Cool Runnings, because I saw it as a kid and I absolutely loved it. And it's one of the last films he was ever in because it came out in 1993. And of course he passed in 1994. I don't know why it was omitted, but it was. So this film features interviews from so many famous people, so many of the people who worked with him. People like Tom Hanks, Catherine O'Hara, Eugene Levy, Martin Short, Christopher Guest, and many, many others. He had a big impact. He really tried to be loyal to people. He tried to help people along with their careers. He tried to give people roles in the films he was in. Might have caused him to say yes to a couple films that he probably shouldn't have. And that's why he had so many kind of not so great films later on in his career, because he wanted to do people favors, and the people he knew that were making these movies who asked him to be in their movies, he would say yes and be in them because he was a nice guy. And sometimes in this documentary actually mentions it, he was a people pleaser, and that might have actually not been good for him in Hollywood because he had trouble saying no, he had trouble turning things down, he had trouble avoiding the kind of things that he needed to avoid to be better for himself. So the drinking, the partying with people, the food, the sort of behavior where he had to be the funny guy all the time and he had to do specific roles and things like that really probably didn't benefit him in the long run. But that's why they say sometimes being a people pleaser in Hollywood isn't great, because you'll have a lot of unsavory people who will take advantage of you, chew you up and spit you out, if you will. So is the documentary worth watching? I think it is. If you're a big John Candy fan, it's a great chance to revisit some of his early works and hear from the people who loved him, like Dan Aykroyd or Tom Hanks or Macaulay Culkin and many others. There's so many, I'm sure I'm missing other people. It's kind of like a chance to sit down and remember the guy. You're not gonna really learn a ton of new information about John Candy. If you're a fan of his, you probably know a lot of the stuff. You probably have seen his movies. You probably know a lot about him already. So this documentary isn't going to be this big eye-opening thing where you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. You probably know a lot of the stuff where you can look it up, but it's a good chance to sit and revisit John Candy, fall back in love with him and his work, because it has been 30 years since he passed. Now, for people who are younger who may not be familiar with John Candy's work, this is a great introduction into who he was, the kind of man he was, how he got his start, and the films he made, because a lot of the films he made are now, 35 to 40 years old and maybe aren't as common for people. Now, I'm sure you've all probably seen one of his films because they're on all the time. So I'm sure everybody knows who John Candy is, but if you're not super familiar with his work, this is a good introduction to John Candy and who he was and the work he did. Because it's been too long, and it's sad because a lot of the comedians that I've loved who have had issues deep down, such as John Candy, Chris Farley, Robin Williams, it's sad to see the suffering that they have inside and behind the scenes, behind the smile, which will hopefully help some other comedians in the future and some people in the future. So give it a watch. It's on Amazon Prime right now. Check it out. If there are other films or videos coming out this month or in the future that you'd like for me to watch, let me know. Maybe I'll watch them, maybe I won't. It just really depends how I'm feeling. And as always, stop scrolling, start watching.